Good old God of War. I can't think of a more iconic gaming franchise, nor a more recognizable protagonist in the Ghost of Sparta, Kratos himself. What's up guys, it's your boy Lordology here, and in today's video I'm going to be taking a look at and ranking all 8 God of Wars and giving my thoughts on what makes this series and each game special in its own way. Now I would like to preface this by saying that I am very much an old school fan, and my perception of the series may be different than a lot of other people, as I've done quite a lot of research for this video and seeing all of the other rankings out there, and it seems that the general consensus amongst most gaming outlets is that Ragnarök is the best in the series. Now I couldn't disagree more with Ragnarök being labelled as the best God of War, which objectively just isn't true, especially if you started the series with the Greek Saga. Also, I won't be including the mobile game God of War Betrayal, though that game is canon, it's just not worth ranking for obvious reasons. Now my thoughts on each of the games has changed somewhat over the years, with my top 3 especially being constantly swapped around for various reasons. And I have no doubt that some of my rankings may be considered controversial, but with a series that doesn't have any bad titles, any God of War ranking will be different from one another, for different reasons of course. I will elaborate further in the video as we go, and with that introduction out of the way, let's get into it. Coming in at number 8, and what I consider to be the weakest God of War, is Chains of Olympus. Of course, in saying that, Chains of Olympus isn't a bad game by any means, but in comparison to the other games in the series, this is definitely the weakest link. Chains of Olympus is chronologically the second game in the series, and was originally released on PSP, and the graphics and gameplay are definitely reflective of that. The combat feels less fluid and more clunky compared to the mainline titles, and the puzzles in the game are easily the most basic and worst in the series. There wasn't a single time while playing Chains of Olympus that I had to actually think about how to complete a puzzle, with most of them being fairly easy to figure out without much thought. The magical abilities on the other hand are actually pretty cool, using Helios' shield to parry, Charon's Wrath, the Gauntlet of Zeus, and the Ifrit that you get from the Persian King is actually pretty fun to use, and what made the game fun for me. And both of the Charon boss fights were an absolute standout. Now on a more positive note, I did actually enjoy the story for this game quite a bit, with the whole plot revolving around Kratos being 5 years deep into his 10-year term to the gods. Helios, the Titan sun god, being kidnapped, and Persephone, the wife of Hades, releasing the Titan Atlas to take revenge against the Olympians, for forcing her into a marriage with Hades by using Helios' power to destroy the Pillar of the World, with Kratos leaving Atlas to hold up the weight of the world for eternity. As far as stories go, Chains of Olympus does well in that department, and I fairly enjoyed the Elysium segment of the game, where Kratos has to reject his daughter Calliope in order to stop Persephone from destroying both Elysium and the gods. Meeting Helios' sister Eos is pretty cool, especially with the Valhalla DLC in mind, and with Helios' involvement. Even the post-credit scene with both Athena and Helios taking back the Gauntlet of Zeus was another highlight, as I would imagine the Olympians don't want Kratos to have that kind of power while still serving his 10-year sentence to the gods. The ending has quite a lot of emotional weight, which makes me appreciate it much more than I originally did, but with the clunky controls and very short playtime, I can't objectively rank Chains of Olympus any higher on this list. Now coming in at number 7, and what is chronologically the first game in the series and the last game in the Greek Saga, is God of War Ascension. Much like Chains of Olympus, Ascension is by no means a bad game and has some great qualities. Funnily enough, I think Ascension has issues opposite that of Chains of Olympus. This time around, Ascension has some fantastic gameplay, but an inconsequential narrative that is not really essential to understanding the God of War mythos. In terms of gameplay, Ascension has some great puzzles and platforming, with the ability to heal and decay structures and objects with the Amulet of Ouroboros, and using duplicates of Kratos for more complex puzzle solving with the Oathstone of Orcos, makes for some great gameplay. And honestly, I found myself having to really consider how to solve many of the challenges in game, and all of the tools available made tackling the challenges quite satisfying to solve. Ascension easily has some of the best combat mechanics in the series, with being able to make use of 4 different elements for the Blades of Chaos, including fire, ice, soul, and lightning, all of which have their own combos, magical abilities, and powers, which makes for a great combat experience. And the ability to make use of the weapons that enemies use, like swords, hammers, spears, and shields during combat, only add to this game's overall gameplay. The only negative I would have to say about the combat is the parry system. Personally, I found the parrying in the other games far more satisfying with a better learning curve than Ascension, but that's just my own personal preference. And the rage meter for Ascension I personally am not the biggest fan of, even though the 4 elements have their own special rage attack. The way that the rage meter works in Ascension is just handled better in the other titles. Ascension's greatest weakness is its narrative, though not for the reasons that people may think. The story takes place 6 months after the death of Lysandra and Calliope, with the Furies having imprisoned Kratos for breaking his blood oath to Ares, with the main plot revolving around Kratos wanting to be rid of the 3 Furies and the visions they give him, and working with Orcos, the son of Alecto and Ares who held Kratos' oath, who informs Kratos that the only reason why Ares saved him from the barbarians was to create the perfect warrior to challenge and overthrow Zeus, which funnily enough Kratos does anyway without Ares. The only way for Kratos to end his bond with Ares is to kill Orcos. This leads to Kratos having nightmares of killing his family, which the bond to Ares protected him from. Easily my favourite part of the story is the visions that the Furies give Kratos, with him being adored by some hot Greek ladies, which I can't show in this video for obvious reasons, being hailed and praised as a hero in Sparta, and finally spending time with Calliope and Lysandra, which is not something we get to see very often. Some other highlights include the boss fight against Castor and Pollux, and the amazing intro boss fight on Hecatoncheires. Now my biggest issue with the story for Ascension overall is, did this story really need to be told? Despite the fact that I quite enjoy the game, I have to ask this question, and the answer is no, not really. And it's this very reason why I can't rank Ascension any higher on this list. Now coming in at number 6, and what is easily going to be the most controversial pick on this list, is God of War Ragnarok. Now Ragnarok is not a bad game by any means and has some fantastic gameplay and combat, though while not my favourite in the series overall. My biggest issues with Ragnarok have everything to do with the pacing of the narrative, the bloated runtime, and the rushed final act of the game. To start off, the gameplay of Ragnarok is excellent, and does improve upon God of War 4 in many ways. Traversal throughout the world gives a lot more freedom to the player, and the puzzles in-game are a great improvement over its predecessor. And easily my favourite part of Ragnarok is the inclusion of the Dropnir Spear, which is my favourite weapon in the game, and helped separate Ragnarok from God of War 4's gameplay. Though there were a few changes made with the Leviathan Axe and Blades of Chaos combos that I personally preferred in God of War 4, but that's really more of a personal preference. Other than that though, outside of a few minor changes from God of War 4's combos, the combat is quite relatively similar to God of War 4, with the addition of making use of several different versions of Rage of Sparta, which helps customize your Kratos, though the idea of light RPG mechanics and leveling is not really what God of War should be about, but that's a topic for another video. The plot for Ragnarok basically revolves around Kratos and Atreus forging their own destiny and not letting fate decide for them, with Atreus not wanting Ragnarok to lead to the death of his father, and Kratos being wary and battle-hardened and not allowing himself to fully embrace the god he once was. Now, much of the narrative deals with Odin, the main villain of the game, wanting to prevent his death at Ragnarok and manipulating Atreus against Kratos to achieve this, with the subplot of the game also dealing with how he belittles and uses his son Thor to carry out his own aims, with many parallels between Thor and Kratos as both parents and gods, with Thor being Kratos' equal in both strength and ability, but opposites in how they treat their children. There are of course many supporting characters in this game, like Brock and Sindri, who are of course returning characters from the first game, with the former being killed by Odin and the latter destroying Odin in the final act of the game. Freya's journey from being vengeful over the death of her son to her being a wise and capable warrior, accepting her past. Her brother Freya, who was one of my favourite side characters in Ragnarok, who served as part of his sister's growth. Thor's wife and daughter, Sif and Thrud, who have great character arcs, especially Sif, who changes for the better in order to save her daughter, and of course Angrboda, who serves as a connection to Atreus' Jotun heritage and a love interest for him. Now, if that seems like a lot of plot threads and character arcs, that's because it is, and there are still major characters in the story that I haven't even mentioned, like Laufey, Heimdall, Mimir, and Tyr for example, which brings me to my first major complaint of Ragnarok, which is its bloated narrative. Ragnarok tries to achieve way too much in this game, with so many plot threads trying to be crammed and explained in a single game, that honestly, it would probably take an hour-long video to explain everything to fully understand the story. This game, out of all of the God of Wars, feels to me as if this should have been the sequel to God of War 4, but not the final. The Norse saga, above all else, should have been a trilogy, and this game is the perfect example of why, with it being way too long and feeling like the most out of place game in the series. What I mean by this is that God of War 4 in comparison let its narrative breathe, with so many cool interesting ideas and concepts that could have been included in Ragnarok, but only a fraction were. Like, for example, all of the murals from God of War 4 could have been expanded upon, like Odin's 8-legged horse for example, or even the entirety of the Helheim storyline from God of War 4 being very dark and elusive, with Mimir telling Kratos never to go there, which is relegated to a basic fetch quest in Ragnarok. There are of course many more examples of this, but I don't want this video to be too long. There are also many plot issues that I find quite annoying, like Kratos blindly following his son despite all of his warnings, whilst saying he doesn't want to take his son to Ragnarok, Thor being a drunk until the final act, which deserved way more game time to explore his character, Odin being way too obsessed with his mask and being way too underutilized for such a conniving villain despite him being fake Tyr, and sending only 2 Valkyries to fight Kratos and Atreus in Muspelheim, who at that time had already killed 9 Valkyries and defeated Freya. Freya joining sides with Kratos way too quickly, Atreus having way more chemistry and connection with Thrud, but the game forces him to like Angrboda because... reasons? There's of course many more issues than this, but I'm sure you guys get my point. My next major issue would have to be the pacing of the game. Yes, Ironwood, I'm looking at you. Many parts of the game feel rushed and deserved way more time to breathe, like the final act of the game being way too cramped, with too many plot threads, and other times the game grinds to a halt to have Atreus and Angrboda have awkward dialogue for hours on end, which on replays of the game is an absolute slog to get through. Even much of the questing in the open world is a real drag, like the Kratos segment of the game in Vanaheim is just a grind to get through, with its only saving grace being the dialogue between characters. This brings me to the positive aspects of Ragnarok. The first being the small dialogue moments between characters, like all of the little references to the old games, like Kratos talking about his brother Deimos, and the killing of his wife and daughter. It's these little moments that make Ragnarok much more enjoyable for me, but arguably the best aspect of Ragnarok is the Valhalla DLC. The DLC reinforces the opinion I had of Kratos at the end of God of War 3, with him making the sacrifice to release hope back into the world. Also, all of the references to God of War 1, including him sacrificing the Greek soldier in Pandora's temple, making his blood oath to Ares, and him feeling remorseful for the boat captain, which I always found a really funny part of God of War 1, and Chains of Olympus, where Kratos sacrifices his chance to be with his daughter to save Olympus, and restores Helios into the sky, are absolutely fantastic moments in the DLC, and the boss fights with Tyr, and including the Blade of Olympus, and the young version of Kratos are absolute highlights. But easily my favourite part of the DLC is the return of Helios, who does an absolutely superb job of being the annoying voice in Kratos' ear, who makes Kratos much more reflective and does a great job of connecting the Norse and Greek stories, along with the development of Mimir and Sigrun's relationship. I cannot praise this DLC enough. Overall, Ragnarok is a game I enjoyed on my first playthrough, with great gameplay and fun boss fights against Heimdall and Thor especially, but in terms of God of War as a series, Ragnarok is one of the weaker entries, with a way too bloated runtime and a rushed narrative that deserved way more time to breathe, perhaps in a third game, with the game's saving grace being the Valhalla DLC. Now coming in at number 5, and what is chronologically the third game in the series, is God of War 1. It absolutely pains me to put God of War 1 in 5th spot due to its significance in the series overall, but I do have my reasons for doing so. God of War 1 is the game that started it all, and even though the game is 20 years old at this point, it still holds up quite well and set the standard for the series going forward, with excellent combat heavily inspired by the Devil May Cry series, with some fun puzzle solving throughout to help balance out the gameplay. Funnily enough, my biggest issue with the first game is its very dated level design in comparison to the other games in the series, with the puzzles and level design being much more refined in later titles. Understandably so, of course. Gameplay-wise, God of War 1 established much of the mechanics that are still used today, so it can be difficult to review and rank this one due to it being the first game in the series, but generally the combat is an absolute highlight, And just like the Arkham games, God of War's combat is easy to learn, but can be hard to master, especially when you want combat to flow with all of the light and heavy attacks, with the use of special moves that you unlock as the game progresses as you upgrade the Blades of Chaos. All 4 of the magical abilities are super fun to use, with Zeus's Fury to attack enemies from a distance, Medusa's Gaze to turn enemies to stone for instant kills, and my 2 favourites that I use quite a lot in combat is Poseidon's Rage and Hades' Army for crazy amounts of AoE damage. The first instance of Spartan Rage in the series can be used in God of War 1, which is called Rage of the Gods, which increases Kratos' attack damage, and compared to Ascension's version of Rage, God of War 1 has a far more fun and straightforward system. The plot for God of War 1 revolves around the events that leads to Kratos going for a swim in the Aegean, that details how after being tasked to kill a Hydra by Poseidon, Kratos is tired of his 10-year servitude to the gods that he undertook so he could get rid of the nightmares that plagued him after being tricked by Ares into killing his family. Athena then tasks Kratos with killing the god of war, and he will be forgiven for his past deeds. This plot device is what drives the narrative of God of War 1, with the majority of the game's story having Kratos search for Pandora's box in a temple located on the back of the Titan Kronos, with Kratos eventually making his way back to Athens, and after a couple of unscheduled detours, he manages to kill the god of war and take revenge. The game then jumps to the present where Athena saves Kratos from getting wet, and tells him that the gods have forgiven him but can't erase his nightmares or his past, so she gives him the Blades of Athena and rewards him with the position of the new god of war. My favourite parts of the story has got to be all of the flashback segments of Kratos remembering how he gave his soul to Ares, with Ares cursing him with the Blades of Chaos, and how Ares tricked Kratos into killing his family, and the Oracle of the Village cursing Kratos by binding the ashes of his dead family to his skin. As for boss fights, the Hydra in the prologue and the final fight against Ares are absolute standouts for me. The narrative for God of War 1 is very focused in what it's trying to achieve with Kratos' single important goal in mind, that makes you want to see through his task to the end. Now, my biggest complaint for the original game, as I stated before, would have to be some of the outdated level design and simple box puzzles that, while not terrible, really hamper the experience overall, like that god-awful spinning spike or whatever it's called when Kratos goes to the underworld, and is just frustrating to deal with, and the fact that I'm mentioning it as a negative shows how bad that thing is. Overall, God of War 1 has a solid narrative and great foundation that set the tone for the series moving forward, despite some of its outdated level design and puzzles. Now, coming in 4th position, and what I consider to be the most underrated God of War, is Ghost of Sparta, which was the second and last title to be released on PSP, and chronologically the 4th game in the series, and the first game we actually see Kratos as the official God of War. There's so much I love about this game. For one, I think in tone, Ghost of Sparta is one of the darkest God of Wars, with a heavy focus on Kratos' origins, with the most fully realised combat system on the PSP platform that feels just as good as the mainline titles. In terms of gameplay, Ghost of Sparta has some pretty cool mechanics that doesn't seem to be present in the rest of the series, like Thera's Bane, which gives Kratos the ability to add fire damage to the Blades of Athena for taking down enemies with armor and solving several environmental puzzles. And of course, the second set of weapons that you can use is the Arms of Sparta, which gives Kratos a shield and spear which can be used to attack enemies from range, solve environmental puzzles, and is also an excellent combat tool that was never really fully replicated in the series again until over 10 years later with Ragnarök. But remember, Ghost of Sparta did it first, with Kratos using a spear and shield in combat. That's arguably one of the most fun weapons to use in Ghost of Sparta. Just like Chains of Olympus, Ghost of Sparta makes use of 3 magical abilities instead of 4, like the mainline titles, which include the Eye of Atlantis, which gives Kratos the ability to electrocute enemies, the Scourge of Erinyes, which sucks enemies into a void that restores Kratos' health, and the Horns of Boreas to freeze enemies in place, with my personal favourite being the Eye of Atlantis. The main plot for Ghost of Sparta is probably the most personal of the Greek Saga for Kratos, with the narrative revolving around Kratos having visions of his mortal past in Sparta, so against Athena's wishes he goes to investigate his origins in Atlantis, which is a fantastic setting for the game, where Kratos discovers his mum Callisto, who he is forced to kill after she transforms into a monster, But before dying, she tells Kratos that his brother Deimos is still alive. After this, he releases the Titan Thera, who erupts a volcano which destroys Atlantis, and Kratos runs into the Gravedigger from God of War 1, who warns Kratos from continuing on this path in search for his brother. Kratos returns to Sparta in search of more details about what happened on the night that Deimos was taken, where Kratos remembers that it was Ares and Athena who kidnapped Deimos when they were children due to a prophecy that foretold of a marked warrior that would bring about the destruction of Olympus, with Zeus and Ares in particular believing that the warrior in question is Deimos. Ares punches out young Kratos, which scars his right eye, and Athena convinces Ares not to kill young Kratos, knowing what he will become, and in honor of his brother, Kratos tattoos his body inspired by the same birthmarks that Deimos was born with, that doomed him to be tortured by the god of death Thanatos. Before reaching Death's domain, Poseidon reveals to Kratos that he is pissed with him for his actions that led to the destruction of his city Atlantis. After this, Kratos finds his brother who battles him as Deimos blames Kratos for his imprisonment. Thanatos, however, gets involved because of Kratos killing his daughter Erinyes, which I can't show in this video since she's not really a PG-friendly boss. Deimos and Kratos team up as brothers to take on the god of death, which results in Thanatos killing Deimos, and Kratos unleashing his full power and killing the god of death. Kratos after this lays his brother to rest, remarking that he is finally free, and leaves the arms of Sparta as a grave marker, with the Gravedigger, who is secretly Zeus, referring to Kratos as Death, the destroyer of worlds, which is actually a piece of Hindu scripture that was used by Robert Oppenheimer in his creation of the atomic bomb. Athena appears and tries to apologize to Kratos, who in turn tells her that the gods will pay for this, and Athena reveals after Kratos leaves that they are siblings, confirming that Zeus is Kratos' father. In a post-credit scene, the Gravedigger, who we know as Zeus, lays Callisto in the grave next to Deimos and says that only one remains. The game ends with Kratos on his throne, signaling the beginning of God of War 2. Man, I just love the story for Ghost of Sparta. There's many cool revelations, seeing a different side to Kratos and getting a better understanding of his hatred for the gods, and the relationship between him and his family is just tragic as hell. Much of Ghost of Sparta I enjoyed thoroughly, so it's hard to single in on one aspect that I enjoyed. Overall, Ghost of Sparta has a fantastic story and gameplay that's really well paced, with a great atmosphere and tone that's unlike any of the other games in the series, and it nearly made my top 3. Now that we're down to the final 3 picks, I always found that over the years, these are the 3 games that are always moving around the most in terms of which I think is the best, but I've given it much thought and made my decision based on what I think God of War is and should be. Now coming in at number 3 is God of War 2018, also known as God of War 4, which is the first game in the Norse saga that began the journey of Christopher Judge's version of Kratos. God of War 4 is arguably one of the greatest video games ever made, with a deeply emotional and focused story revolving around the relationship between Kratos and his son Atreus, introducing a new combat system unlike anything else seen in the series, with an over-the-shoulder camera to bring the player closer to the action, as well as using a new type of weapon being the Leviathan axe, which is now arguably one of the best weapons in the series. In terms of gameplay, I am of the opinion that despite the changes, God of War 4 still feels like God of War, with environmental puzzles using the Leviathan axe and the Blades of Chaos to solve, along with now using Atreus as a guide to the Norse world. This time around, instead of special moves like in the Greek Saga, the Norse Saga makes use of runic attacks that replace this function, and the series introduces light RPG mechanics with leveling and upgrading weapons and gear to better face more difficult opponents, and the ability to customize your Kratos to how you want to play. Whether that be with a build that relies on runic attacks and cooldowns, which the Valkyrie armor is best suited for, or perhaps a luck-based build, which increases perk activation that is best utilized with Sindri's armor. Now that is a part of the reason why I rank God of War as third, because light RPG mechanics and an open world is more of a modern gaming feature that literally all video games have nowadays and is becoming less unique. I also find it kind of odd that an enemy that Kratos would easily be able to defeat with understanding the moveset of said enemy is near impossible because the enemies are given way too much health at higher levels and difficulties, And I personally think that games that increases enemy health instead of the player's damage output just makes no sense, like the new Assassin's Creed RPG games really suffers from this issue. But Ghost of Tsushima, on the other hand, has one of the best modern difficulty systems, with enemies that can kill you in 1 to 2 hits, but you can also do the same to them, which prioritizes skill and not spamming the dodge or blocking button. But while I do think this is more of a personal preference, it's something that is becoming quite common in lots of games that does include God of War 4, despite the game being one of my favourites in the series. The main narrative for God of War 4 revolves around Kratos and Atreus taking the ashes of Faye, Kratos' wife and Atreus' mother respectively, to the highest peak in the 9 realms, and along the journey they encounter many allies and villains, including Mimir, who serves as the lore master that fills in Kratos and Atreus on all of the myths and legends in the 9 realms, with his stories about Odin and Thor being particularly violent and chilling. It's Mimir's stories that I think helped to superbly set up what ended up being a bloated sequel. Freya serves as the middle ground in the story, with her connection to the game's main villain Baldur, and her having respect for Kratos as a parent and giving him advice on being upfront with Atreus about being a god, which he doesn't know and causes him to become sick for denying his nature. The dwarves Brock and Sindri serve as the comedic relief in the game, with learning about the brothers' relationship and hearing how they forged Thor's hammer Mjolnir and the Leviathan axe which Kratos inherited from Faye, with the culmination of the brothers coming together and putting aside their differences. The main villains of the game include Baldur, the god of light, who was made invulnerable against his wishes by Freya, and is manipulated by Odin into believing that the cure to getting rid of his invulnerability was to find the Jotun Laufey, which leads him to finding Kratos and Atreus with the new mission of bringing them to Asgard, and Baldur uses Thor's sons Magni and Modi to achieve this end, both of which were treated poorly by their parents Thor and Sif during their childhoods, which is a great reflection of how Atreus would have turned out if he didn't have Kratos and Faye as parents, with Kratos' main lesson to his son being that they must be better. Throughout the journey, Kratos and Atreus encounter many different worlds, enemies, and creatures, with the highlights for me personally being the elven realm of Alfheim, the realm of the dead Helheim, and the bonus realms of Niflheim and Muspelheim. Some of the best boss encounters definitely include killing Magni and Modi, and for the repercussions that those deaths will have for the story moving forward. The 9 Valkyrie bosses, which is an excellent side story in-game, and arguably the Sigrun boss fight in particular is one of the hardest boss fights in any God of War. And of course the boss fights against Baldur, which culminates in Atreus accidentally using mistletoe to cure Baldur from his invulnerability. And in an act of mercy, Kratos saves Freya by quoting Zeus from God of War 2, saying that the cycle ends here. Wanting to end the cycle of violence between gods with the constant cycle of sons killing fathers and fathers killing sons, which is one of the excellent recurring themes not only throughout God of War 4, but the series as a whole. The game ends with Kratos and Atreus making it to Jotunheim and spreading Faye's ashes, and discovering that Atreus' Jotun name is Loki, and that it's prophesied that Kratos will die at Ragnarok, with Mimir revealing that Freya had retrieved her Valkyrie wings to take revenge on Kratos for killing Baldur, and Thor visiting Kratos and Atreus in the post-credit scene ending. God of War 2018 is a fantastic game overall, and hinted and promised at so much that unfortunately, Ragnarok wasn't able to deliver, and it's this reason why I can't rank it higher than 3rd, despite it being an absolute masterpiece and absolutely deserving of Game of the Year in my opinion at least. The story is super focused in what it's trying to tell, and gameplay, while not my favourite in the series, is implemented very well in this awesome game. Now, ranking the last two is probably been the hardest part of making this video, since both games are peak God of War in my opinion, and I can see an argument being made for either taking top spot, but I'm going to have to go with what I consider to be my favourite overall. So with that being said, and coming in at number 2 is God of War 2. The masterful sequel to God of War 1 that improved upon its predecessor in every way possible, and is widely considered to be the best action game of all time, with better boss fights, combat, mechanics, gameplay, and puzzles overall. The combat in particular has much more animations, with the special moves and combos being given much more love and care in the sequel, and the rage of the gods is replaced by the rage of the Titans, which turns Kratos into a walking fireball. As well as the blades of Athena, Kratos also gains several more weapons like the Barbarian's Hammer, the Spear of Destiny, and the Blade of Olympus at several points throughout the story. He can also make use of 4 new magical abilities, including Typhon's Bane, that serves as the ranged weapon, Kronos' Rage for lightning damage, the Head of Uriel, similar to the Head of Medusa, is used to turn enemies to stone, and Atlas's Quake, which makes the ground tremble, with Kronos' Rage and Atlas's Quake being my personal favourites. As well as these combat tools, Kratos also has much more environmental equipment in the sequel, including Icarus's wings to reach unreachable places, the Amulet of the Fates to slow down time, and the Golden Fleece used for puzzles, along with allowing for more powerful and damaging parries and counterattacks. The main narrative of God of War 2 revolves around Kratos being the new god of war and being shunned by the other gods of Olympus for his warmongering, for which Athena warns Kratos to not continue on this path of destruction. After this, Zeus interferes in Kratos' rampage on Rhodes and takes away Kratos' godly form as an eagle, who Kratos believes is Athena. Zeus presents the Blade of Olympus to Kratos and tells him to drain the rest of his powers into the sword to defeat the Colossus of Rhodes, after which it is revealed that Zeus tricked Kratos into doing this so he could finally weaken him, since Athena refused to do so, and offers him the choice of serving the gods once again. And since Kratos is Kratos, he tells Zeus to shove it, for which Zeus kills him with the Blade of Olympus, destroys his army of Spartans, and casts him into the underworld. He is then saved by the Titan Gaia, who instructs him to find the Sisters of Fate, as they can give him the power to travel back in time to stop Zeus from betraying and killing him. So begins the hunt for the Sisters of Fate, which much of the game's narrative and gameplay revolves around. Along the way, Kratos learns more of Zeus's past from Gaia, and how she raised Zeus and kept him safe from his father Kronos, who wanted to eat him. He comes across Gaia's brother Typhon, for which he acquires a bow and uses it to free the Titan Prometheus, who was cursed by Zeus for gifting fire to mankind. Kratos flies Pegasus to get to the island of creation in his search for the sisters, and along the way he comes across Theseus, who is the son of Poseidon and founder of Athens, who Kratos kills with a door. Further along his way to the sisters, Kratos comes across many enemies, like the reincarnated barbarian king, who was the reason why Kratos made his blood pact with Ares, Medusa's immortal sister Uriel, Perseus, the son of Zeus who killed Medusa in Greek mythology, but not in God of War, since Kratos killed Medusa in God of War 1, and of course Icarus, who in Greek mythology flew far too close to the sun, and in God of War is the son of the architect Daedalus, who created the labyrinth that contained the key to Pandora's box. After obtaining the wings of Icarus, Kratos runs into Atlas, who was voiced by the legendary Michael Clarke Duncan, who is still a little pissed at Kratos for where he left him at the end of Chains of Olympus. Kratos convinces Atlas that they both want Zeus dead, so Atlas tells Kratos that the key to defeating Zeus is the Blade of Olympus, as that was the weapon responsible for ending the Great War between the Titans and Olympians. With the help of Atlas, Kratos makes his way to the Palace of the Fates, where he is forced to kill an unseen enemy, which turns out to be one of his Spartan allies who survived in Rhodes, who tells Kratos that Zeus had destroyed Sparta, with Kratos yelling out one of his most iconic lines.
Zeus! Is this how you face me, coward? I am through doing the bidding of the gods! Come down here and face me now, Zeus!
With this knowledge, Kratos kills the Kraken and rides the Phoenix to the sisters, where he kills 2 of the sisters, being Atropos and Lachesis, for refusing to help him. Killing the big sister Clotho, Kratos acquires the Loom of Fate and turns back time to the moment before Zeus killed Kratos at the beginning of the story. Kratos battles Zeus with the Blade of Olympus and nearly kills him, but is stopped by Athena, who sacrifices herself to protect Zeus from Kratos' wrath. Before dying, Athena tells Kratos that he is Zeus' son, and the reason for Zeus' betrayal was because Zeus was afraid that Kratos would take his throne, just as Zeus had done to his own father Kronos. With Athena's death, Kratos declares all-out war on Olympus, and travels back in time again to the Great War, where he rescues all of the Titans and brings them to Mount Olympus in the present, where he declares that Zeus' son has returned, accepting his lineage. Now, from start to finish, the story of God of War 2 is well paced, well told, and has excellent gameplay and puzzles throughout. That makes it very hard for me to critique and rank it for just how bloody awesome it is. The music, the combat, the dialogue, it just holds up so bloody well and is just as badass and iconic as it was back in the day. But there's still one game that I think manages to do it slightly better. Now finally, coming in at number 1, and what is my personal favourite God of War game of all time, is God of War 3, which brought the Greek Saga to an end with an absolutely bombastic finale that whenever Kratos warns the Norse gods of facing the god he once was, it's the god he was in this game that he is referring to. God of War 2 managed to improve the combat, gameplay, boss fights, and mechanics in every way, and God of War 3 takes it even further. Visually, God of War 3 is absolutely stunning, with beautiful and gritty set pieces. With each god that Kratos kills, the Greek world falls further and further into chaos and darkness. The combat for God of War 3 is somehow improved upon even further, with much better looking and smoother animations, with the inclusion of the new ranged grab maneuver with the Blades of Exile that add much more fluidity and dynamic combos, which also include being able to switch between all 4 main weapons in the game for quick combos by holding down L1 and pressing X. Arguably, this is the most fully realized combat system of the Greek Saga, even better than Ascension in my opinion, and the weapons that Kratos gains are all fantastic, like one of the most visually pleasing weapons in the series, the Blades of Exile. Also, the Claws of Hades that have really unique and interesting combos, the Nemean Cestus to get up and personal with enemies and take down environmental obstructions, and the Nemesis Whip, which does lightning damage and focuses on a lot of aerial combos, and is one of my personal favourites. The magical ability system has been revamped, and now all magical abilities are tied to the 4 weapons, including Army of Sparta, which can only be used with the Blades of Exile, the Claws of Hades Soul Summon abilities, the Nemean Cestus has Nemean Roar, and the Nemesis Whip, which can use the really cool Nemesis Rage. Just like in God of War 2, there's also many environmental tools that can be acquired to use to solve puzzles, find secrets, and aid you in combat, with the Wings of Icarus, Poseidon's Trident, and the Golden Fleece making a return, with the new additions of Apollo's Bow for range damage, Helios's Head to blind enemies and light up dark areas, and Hermes' Boots to be used to send enemies flying, and reach areas only available with this story item. The main narrative for God of War 3 revolves around Kratos ascending Mount Olympus with the Titans he rescued at the end of God of War 2, and in response, Poseidon launches an all-out assault on Kratos, and in one of the most bombastic boss fights in the series, Kratos gives Poseidon an eye examination, which causes the oceans to completely flood the Greek world. And once making it to the top, Zeus finger blasts Gaia and Kratos off the mountain, and Gaia refuses to save Kratos as she sees him as only a pawn for the Titans, and he falls into the river Styx. He loses the Blade of Olympus, and the Blades of Athena are completely ruined, which had been Kratos' main weapon for several games at this point. Making his way out, he comes across Athena in spirit form, who has ascended to a higher existence for her sacrifice in the last game. Athena gifts Kratos with the Blades of Exile, and instructs him to seek out the Flame of Olympus in order to kill Zeus. Moving on, Kratos comes across the 3 judges of the underworld and the Chains of Balance. While exploring the area, Kratos comes across what appears to be a hologram of Pandora, who Kratos mistakes for his daughter Calliope, and recovers the Blade of Olympus, which functions as God of War 3's Rage of Sparta ability, which is probably my favourite version of this ability since Kratos makes use of one of the most iconic weapons in the franchise. Kratos comes across the blacksmith god Hephaestus, who is the husband of the goddess of love Aphrodite and the father to Pandora. Kratos makes his way through the underworld and finds a shrine of sorts to Persephone, Hades' wife who Kratos killed in Chains of Olympus. And after locating Hades, Kratos kills the god of the underworld in a pretty visually striking boss fight, which releases all of the souls of the underworld. Kratos makes his way back to Olympus, where he comes across a wounded Gaia, who pleads for Kratos' help, and in response, Kratos separates her arm from her body, as a thank you of course. Along the way, Kratos kills the sun god Helios, who he had saved in Chains of Olympus, by giving him a head massage, and also kills the titan Perseus, who is the god of destruction, with the Blade of Olympus. Continuing on his trek, Kratos comes across Pandora's box, which is surrounded by the Flame of Olympus, and the only way to quell the flame is with Pandora herself. All the while, Kratos has been on the tail of the annoying messenger of the gods, Hermes, and the whole segment of Kratos chasing him and finally catching him is pretty hilarious, and one of the more funnier boss fights in the game. And after killing Hermes, a plague is then released on the Greek world. Kratos makes his way to the forum and meets a drunk Hera, who is the wife of Zeus and goddess of women and marriage. Kratos demands that she reveal Pandora's location, but she refuses and summons Hercules, Kratos' half-brother who's twice his size and very jealous of him. He also states that out of all of Zeus' children, Kratos is his favourite. This leads to Hercules and Kratos solving their differences by pummeling each other in one of the best boss fights in the game, which ends in another god's death. Kratos then comes across the lovely Aphrodite, who leads him back to her husband Hephaestus, but not before Kratos does the dance with no pants with his half-sister, which is both funny and disturbing. But anyway, Hephaestus sends Kratos to retrieve the Olympus stone, claiming that he'll be able to craft a new weapon for Kratos. Kratos then travels deeper through Tartarus and discovers Kronos having been banished there by Zeus for Kratos' actions in God of War 1. Kronos tries to kill Kratos, and in response, Kratos rips Kronos to shreds, literally both inside and out, and recovers the Olympus stone, and returns to Hephaestus, who after creating the new weapon, tries to kill Kratos, but ends up impaling himself on his own anvil, and reveals that he was only trying to protect his daughter since she was imprisoned in the labyrinth after Kratos opened her box in God of War 1. Kratos heads back through Aphrodite's gate and comes across Hera's garden, where she berates Kratos for his destruction of Olympus, but it's not until she insults Pandora that Kratos turns on her and kills her, which destroys all plant life in the Greek world. Making his way to the labyrinth, Kratos comes across Daedalus, the creator of the labyrinth, who has been imprisoned by Zeus, who is kind of upset about Kratos killing his son Icarus in the previous game. And because of Kratos solving the puzzles to reach Pandora, Daedalus is killed and put out of his misery. Kratos finally meets up with Pandora, and she is such a great addition to the game and kind of serves as a proto-Atreus, with the first time in the Greek Saga seeing a much more thoughtful Kratos who clearly cares about Pandora and even tries to teach her about the harsh reality of the world, which is very reminiscent of how Kratos is in the Norse sequel. And one of the main complaints I see about Norse Kratos is he's too different from Kratos from the Greek Saga, and while I think that's true for the most part, much of God of War 3's plot would indicate differently, especially with Pandora's influence on Kratos' character. But moving on. Kratos makes his way to the box of Pandora and doesn't want Pandora to sacrifice herself to dispel the flames, which is quite a surprise given Kratos' direction, but shows some character growth on his part. But anyway, Zeus appears and threatens to kill Pandora, and Pandora wants to sacrifice herself, despite Kratos' reluctance. Kratos and Zeus engage in a pretty badass and cinematic boss fight, and Kratos' anger overcomes him, and Pandora gets her wish to be sacrificed. Kratos opens Pandora's box and finds it empty and absolutely loses it at Zeus. As they continue their fight, Gaia appears, revealing that she survived, and tries to kill both of them, which leads to the next stage of the boss fight inside of Gaia's chest, where Kratos destroys Gaia's heart and impales Zeus with the blade of Olympus. Kratos decides to leave, believing that he has killed Zeus, and is attacked by Zeus' astral form, who takes away Kratos' weapons and powers. But before Zeus can kill Kratos, he is saved by a vision of Pandora during a journey into his mind, where she tells Kratos about the strength of hope, hinting at Kratos being a god of hope. And with the help from the spirits of his daughter Calliope and his wife Lysandra, Kratos finally forgives himself for his past and gains the power of hope. He forces Zeus' spirit back into his body and then absolutely pummels him, which funnily enough makes the entire screen red, and he finally puts an end to the king of Olympus and his own father. Kratos looks upon Greece and the destruction that's been caused by his vengeance. Athena then reappears and demands that Kratos return what she thinks he took from Pandora's box. Kratos informs her that it was empty, but she thinks he's lying and explains that when Zeus sealed the evils of the world in the box, after the Great War against the Titans, Athena placed the power of hope in it as well, foreseeing that it would eventually be opened. Athena then realized that when Kratos opened the box to defeat Ares, the evils of the box escaped and slowly corrupted the gods, while Kratos was filled with the power of hope, which had been hidden by the guilt and failures of his past, which explains much of the plot of the entire Greek Saga, and why many of the Olympians have a different attitude towards Kratos from God of War 1 prior to him opening Pandora's box. Athena demands that Kratos return the power of hope to her, intending to establish her own rule over Greece. Kratos, being who he is, refuses and scratches himself with the blade of Olympus so that hope can be given back to mankind, much like how Prometheus introduced fire to mankind. Athena, disappointed by Kratos' decision, decides to leave him to his fate while Kratos collapses. But it is revealed in a post-credits scene that Kratos' body is missing, with a bloody trail leading away, hinting that the ghost of Sparta had in fact survived. There's actually an alternate ending that the original creator David Jaffe originally wanted for God of War 3, which is quite different from the actual ending, which was also based on game director Stig Asmussen's vision. And David Jaffe's idea was that, and I quote, God of War explains, or ultimately will explain, why there are no more Greek myths, end quote. He also said that it would have been hell on earth as the gods and titans battled each other for domination, and other mythological pantheons from different religions would have become involved after Kratos killed Zeus and the other Greek gods, and this would lead to humankind no longer believing in the gods, which according to David Jaffe, its belief in gods or lack thereof is the only way a god can truly die. God of War 3 not only marks the end of the Greek Saga, it also marks the end of an era for this type of video game. And I know that most OG fans would put God of War 2 in their top spot, but for me, God of War 3 is the peak of everything great about God of War. Excellent combat, cool platforming and puzzles, interesting stories and characters with enormous set pieces, cinematic moments, and amazing and memorable boss fights, which God of War 3 tops in the series. And above all else, the God of War 3 version of Kratos is the rendition of the character that everyone thinks about when Kratos references how hateful and bloodthirsty he was in the Norse saga. Now this comes to the end of my ranking, narrative, and gameplay review and summaries of all of the God of War games in this timeless franchise. And now I want to hear from you guys. Do you guys agree with my ranking, or would you have ranked the games differently? Either way, let me know in the comments, and I would like to say a massive thank you to my channel members, as it's thanks to you fine folks that make these videos possible. And if you guys would like to support my content, then consider becoming a member, and if not, then consider giving the video a like and subscribing if you want to see more content like this. With all that being said, I hope you guys all have a wonderful day. Be sure to drink lots of water and get some sleep, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Cheers.
You lost everything and everyone. You became... There is no forgiving you. You chose! I chose. And now, should I, this same man, should I sit, take, proclaim, lead, place myself in service? In service? Should I lose everything and everyone? There's to be enough left inside so that I do not become you. I do not know. But I have hope. You are cruel and arrogant and selfish. But you are more than that. You have always been more than what others saw. You are more than that.
like I missed everything. Did you find what you needed? Glad to hear it, brother. We're done here then, so, what now?
No. I believe I would like to sit here for a while.